It's great to be here today, and I appreciate you patching in to listen to my webinar. So, just a real quick overview about me. I am the science coordinator for the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. I've been with MNFI for a little over 21 years, and I'm actually serving as our interim director at the moment. And, most of my work over the years has focused a lot on wetlands and birds in general, but especially wetland birds. It's where a lot of my graduate and work research is focused. And what I'm going to do today is talk about what's been going on within our region with regard to marsh bird surveys and research. It's a group of birds that there's still a lot we don't know about them, but there's been increasing interest about them over in about the last 15 years or so. So I'll kind of give you an overview, some history on how we've gotten more organized and working together in the marsh bird world. I'll give you some examples of some projects that I've taken the lead on that have helped to improve what we know about marsh birds in Michigan and then the Great Lakes more broadly. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges we've seen with trying to keep regional monitoring going, and then some kind of paths forward and where we might go here in the near future. So I think the first place we should probably start is what do we mean by marsh birds? A lot of birds use marshes, some that aren't even really wetland obligate. But usually when you hear the term marsh birds, although it's not a taxonomic term, we're talking about secretive marsh birds. So things like, grebes, bitterns, rails, gallinules, coots. These are often referred to as secretive marsh birds. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer in that if you've ever heard an American bittern or a pie-billed grebe in the middle of the breeding season calling, they're hardly secretive. But these species do use habitats that are, densely vegetated. So a lot of these species you'll hear them, but you don't often see them. And they're often difficult to access these areas. So, they're places where a lot of people don't necessarily go. And in general, it's a group of species. When you compare it to a group like waterfowl that, we've been studying for a very long time, there's still a lot we don't know about these birds. And they're not covered well by existing standard surveys. If you're familiar with the North American Breeding Bird Survey, it's been going on since the mid 1960s. It's a road-based survey. So it gives us great data on birds in North America. But wetland dependent species like these are not picked up well in these standard road-based surveys. So just to kind of highlight why are we concerned about these species? Even though we don't have great data, there's a feeling that a lot of these wetland dependent species have been declining for some time. Because of that, they've gotten a lot more attention in some of our bird conservation plans. Several of these species are focal species of the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture, which is a partnership of agencies and nonprofit organizations that are working for bird conservation within the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi regions. Several of these species are high priorities under the Regional Waterbird Plan, which is a step-down plan of the Continental Waterbird Plan. And, a lot of these species are endangered, threatened, special concern at the state level, and they've been incorporated as species of greatest conservation need in several of the state wildlife action plans for states in our region. So it's easy to see why, these are a group of species that, we need to learn more about. We need to have an idea of their status, and so that we can do appropriate conservation work for them. So there's been, a fairly extensive history of increasing coordination for this bird group. And, there's been research on these species going on for a long, long time. But they were getting more attention in the 1990s, and there were researchers working, and a common technique that we use for these species are the use of electronically broadcast calls to elicit responses. It's an effective technique for them, especially for, like I said, you don't typically see these species. So if we can have a better way to detect them, that's a common way to do it. But different researchers, of course, were using different techniques, and a lot of the people at the time saw an opportunity to have people start using similar protocols so that the data could be combined into larger scale analyses. And that interest resulted in a continental workshop back in 1998, where a lot of agencies, university folks from Canada and the US got together and started talking about developing a North American protocol. And that resulted in a draft protocol being put out in 2004. It's since been refined and was published in Waterbirds in 2011. And then concurrent with that protocol, there was some interest in developing a large scale survey in the US and perhaps larger that would be on the scale of like the breeding bird survey I mentioned. For that kind of an effort, you really need some kind of a sample design. You need the protocol of how you do the point counts, but you also need to figure out, well, where are we putting the points where we do the surveys, and how do we do that? Well, there was kind of a concurrent effort to develop a spatially balanced sample design that was then published in 2009. So when there was this interest in getting kind of a large scale survey going, they piloted the combination of the sample design and the survey protocol in several states. And Wisconsin was the first state that started piloting this program in 2008. And then other states like Michigan, we got on board in 2010, and then some others got started thereafter. Now, what ultimately happened, and then there was another national summit, Marsh Bird Summit in 2011. And after seeing the early results of the pilot surveys in Wisconsin and several other states, it was clear that, having kind of this large omnibus marsh bird survey at a continental scale just wasn't going to be practical. And I can get into some of that later, but these surveys are expensive to develop. They're difficult to implement, and the level of sampling you need at that scale would be pretty immense. So it was clear that scale wasn't going to happen. But several of us in the Midwest had been working together kind of informally, and we were faced with the decision, well, what do we do? Do we keep these things going? Do we keep working together? And there was a lot of interest to do that. I had been working with Ryan Brady in Wisconsin. When Ohio came on board, they were talking with us, and then Minnesota, when they came on board, we were all working together really well and doing things like trying to coordinate our target species and making sure the way we were doing things was complementary. And that informal group, we kind of realized we need to kind of start formalizing this a little bit more. And we did that in 2012. We started what's now called the Midwest Marsh Bird Working Group. And as part of that, we developed monitoring objectives. We then later developed some research questions that we felt we could address through this large coordinated data set. In 2018, we developed a 3-year action plan that we've made good progress on. And based on some of the analysis I'm going to present here in a bit, we updated our monitoring objectives. And this partnership has morphed into a new initiative that's really aiming at increasing conservation work specifically for marsh birds on the landscape based on all the knowledge we've gained in the last 15, 20 years. And I'll kind of wrap up with some more information on that. So that's a quick history and kind of how we've gotten to where we are today. I want to just highlight again a little couple of things on the protocol here. These are the 10 target, or the 10 target species we use for the marsh bird survey in Michigan, as well as I think it's the same for Wisconsin. And these again are these primary species are those targeted secretive marsh birds. So again, rails, bitterns, coots, gallinules, and we also added Wilson snipe because they breed in the same habitats. As part of the protocol, there's also an option to include what we call secondary target species. And these are species that are also wetland dependent, that some of which are also of concern. We've got here like marsh wren, sedge wren, yellow-headed blackbird. Those are all special concern in Michigan. Our marsh nesting terns, black tern, Forster's tern, they're threatened in our state. So we have an opportunity to gather data on some of these other species while we're out targeting those primary species. And there's some nuances in the data we collect, but it provides really valuable information without overwhelming the surveyors and trying to survey for everything that's out there. If we were to do that, it would be pretty difficult, with things like red-winged blackbirds being pretty numerous out there. So along with those primary species, we're gathering good information on a handful of other species while we're out there. And, just really briefly, the way we do this, we do 3 surveys per season at each of our survey points. They're point counts. They're 10-minute point counts. We have a 5-minute passive listening period, and then we do 1-minute broadcast for 5 additional species. And then again, we're focusing on those secretive species, but also gathering the data on the secondary species. These surveys can be done either in the early morning or late evening before dark. And if you're interested in learning more, I did put the citation for the publication that gives more detail on this protocol. So I mentioned how for our surveys, we marry the protocol with this sample design. And at the bottom of the screen, I put the publication that describes the sample design in more detail, but it's essentially a spatially balanced approach, but it tries to cluster points, which are our secondary sample units, in a way that makes sampling more efficient. So essentially what we do is we overlay the area of interest. Here I show Michigan it's a hexagon that's a 40 square kilometer area. Within those area, or across those hexagons that cover the state, we take a random sample from within each of those sample units that are selected. We then use National Wetlands Inventory data to try to identify potential habitats. So we're looking for emergent and split class area wetland types with emergent in the classification as potential habitats. So within those selected primary sample units, we then create random points within emergent wetlands of that selected PSU. And those are our secondary sample units. And we do an oversample. Like for this example, we probably have about 20 or so potential points. But within that, our goal is to get a survey route, so to speak, that's somewhere usually from about 5 to 10 points, no more than 10. It'd be difficult to get more than that in a given morning anyway. So then we have to go through some ground truthing to actually visit those points and refine which of those are actually accessible on the ground, make sure they have potential habitat. And it's a fairly labor-intensive process, but the ultimate, what we end up with is a set of these selected primary sample units within which we have a route of survey points that we go and visit 3 times in each breeding season. And that's generally in May and June. And we start in the southern part of the region earlier and then later in the northern part of the region. So the strength in this is really we have, a solid protocol that's standardized but allows some flexibility based on your location, that's combined with this statistically robust sample design. So we here, the partners in the Midwest really saw this as a good approach for us to try to learn more about these species and better understand their status and better understand their habitat needs and address some of these information needs that we have. So, after we started coordinating, we really started to build this working group and really nail down what are the information needs that we have as a region. What are the things we want to try to address with this coordinated survey program? And we came up with our two main monitoring objectives. The first is really to estimate some population parameters at the regional scale. So we wanted to have a sense of, how many of these species are of each species are out there. Do some things like estimating probability of occupancy, assess trends, and hopefully detect some of these really rare species while we're out there as well. And we wanted to use this data and some other habitat information that we gather while we're out there to start getting an understanding of how marsh bird use relates to some of these habitat variables. So those were our monitoring objectives. We knew that by gathering this data set, we'd have an opportunity to also address some other information needs. And we put some time as a working group into surveying not just people doing research and monitoring, but people that are managing wetlands, that are conserving wetland habitats through things like restoration and invasive species management. We asked them, what are the things you need to know about marsh birds to implement conservation work? And it really came down to three questions that came to the top through that survey effort. And they were to understand how marsh birds respond to wetlands with water level control that are really managed primarily for waterfowl. And are there things that we could do from a management standpoint that could maximize use by both bird groups? There was also interest in understanding how marsh birds respond to restored wetlands in comparison to naturally occurring wetlands. And then last, there was interest in understanding how birds respond to invasive species, as well as management that's targeting trying to eradicate some of these invasive plant species. So these are some of those information needs that have been guiding the work we've been doing. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take some projects I've been involved with that have involved a whole long list of collaborators that show you examples of how we've addressed some of these information needs. And I'm going to just give a real quick, thumbnail sketch of each project. I'm not going to get into a lot of details on methods. I'm just going to give you some highlights of the results. But I wanted to give you the links. If you want to dig into the details, you can go to our website and download the actual report. So I've got the links here and get into more information. But these projects kind of fall into two categories. The first two are analyses that we did of this coordinated data set from marsh bird survey. So compiling data from the different state surveys and just doing some analysis to address some different questions. The second two projects are, we used the data from the larger coordinated marsh bird surveys, but we also gathered additional data. So it was a combination of new data and the survey data from the regional scale. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we've done these different projects. So the first one was a project that tried to get at that research question of how do marsh birds respond to areas that are managed wetlands, impounded wetlands. So we have water level control through things like dikes and water control structures, and how marsh bird use of those sites compares to more naturally occurring wetlands with no water level control. So this was a project that I worked with folks from Wisconsin and Ohio. We combined the data from the 3 states together to try to just do use the information we have to do a quick assessment of how do these marsh birds seem to be responding. And this took place through, we used data from basically the start of Wisconsin survey through 2015. And the first step was to classify our points that fall in these wetlands and as either falling within an impounded wetland or just a natural unimpounded, unaltered site. So we did this through a lot of aerial photo interpretation, for those of us that know each of the states. And, there's kind of a continuum of sites. You'd find some that were impounded, perhaps partially impounded by a road embankment or railroad grade, or you might find, beaver floodings. And then, there's a whole continuum of points. And then from that, after we classified them all, we took those that were clearly managed wetlands with water level control, and those that were clearly not altered by any alteration of hydrology that we could see through the aerial photo interpretation, so that we were kind of trying to make a really valid comparison here. So from that, we did different analyses. This table just highlights our comparisons that we made of marsh bird abundance. And our measure of abundance was simply the number of detections we had within 100 meters of each point. And so we did that. We created estimates for impounded and then not impounded wetlands and did a statistical comparison. So here you can see of the species that we had enough data to analyze, those with the bolded p-values are those where we saw a statistically significant difference. Now, what's interesting here is that we didn't find any that were more abundant in the not impounded wetlands, but several species that did show greater abundance in the impounded wetlands. So you can see those highlighted here. We had the 2 bittern species, pie-bill grebe, Virginia rail, coot, sandhill crane, and then marsh wren and swamp sparrow. Just a couple that didn't show any statistical difference. Now, what's interesting is this is pretty consistent with what other studies have found that have been done fairly recently. This pattern of greater abundance, and we saw the same pattern with increased estimates of occupancy. We did occupancy modeling that basically produces an estimate of the probability that a site is occupied by the species you're analyzing after accounting for imperfect detection. So we know we're not finding every Virginia rail that's likely out there. There's imperfect detection, and these models help account for that. So even after accounting for imperfect detection, we saw the same pattern of greater occupancy for most of these species in the impounded wetlands, consistent with what we found for abundance. And other studies have found that. Doug Tozier did research in some wetlands in Ontario along the Lake Ontario and saw similar response to conservation projects with greater marsh bird abundance. We also did some analyses to look at some associations with surrounding land cover, and we saw probability of occupancy was associated positively with the amount of emergent wetland within 200 meters of the point, and negatively related to the amount of upland forest, which again is pretty consistent with what other studies have found. So this is good news for marsh birds in that it looks like, at least for the areas we looked at in this kind of course level analysis, seem to benefit from management targeting waterfowl. And that's an assumption a lot of people involved with waterfowl management have assumed for a long time. So that's valuable. What I and my collaborators would like to see is an experimental approach to see if what happens when we do different types of water level management in these wetlands, and take an experimental approach and see, can we optimize, perhaps get even more marsh bird use and waterfowl use, and do some experimental management and monitoring that builds on what we've done here to see if we can refine management further for these species. Okay, so let's move to the next project. And this was a regional analysis that I led with several collaborators, and the objective was to take the data that we have within the region and try to use some models to estimate population abundance within the region. You know, a important impetus of the developing this large scale surveys across the country was because, you know, several of these species are hunted species. We hunt, you know, snipe, we hunt rails, but yet we don't have much information on population size. So that if you're a biologist regulating take of these species, that probably makes you a little queasy. And so there was interest in trying to have a better estimate of what population sizes were for some of these species. So that was kind of an interest of a lot of our partners here in the Midwest. So we wanted to do some different modeling efforts to develop estimates. And then we also saw it as an opportunity. Once we have these estimates, we can use some of the numbers to help us understand how good of a job our survey can do in estimating populations, tracking trends, and things of that nature. So for this project, we used over 1,000 points that have been sampled across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. We used some different models like distance sampling and a couple of other models to estimate abundance. We also used occupancy modeling again as a way to incorporate imperfect detection, and then use the data gathered this was up through 2017 when we did the analysis, to estimate these population densities. And then based on those densities, we estimated the amount of potential habitat within the region, and using National Wetlands Inventory. And we really focused on those emergent wetlands. So if we know a density and we know and have an estimate of how much area we have of potential habitat, we can do some simple mathematics to just come up with an overall population estimate. So this is, we did this in a couple of different ways, and I'll walk you through this table, but these are the kind of the raw results. We did the analysis for these 6 species that had enough detections to enough data to really allow the analyses. And the models we used distance sampling, which is a way to adjust estimates based on decreasing probability of detection as things are further away from the observer. We use the N mixture and heterogeneity models, which are abundance models that are really commonly used in the field to estimate population sizes. So that the top few rows here show our density estimates, both just with the raw numbers and then through these different models. And then I did a just simple average, as well as the standard errors. So then we used, in the report, if you dig into it, we used a couple of different estimates on the amount of habitat. We kind of had a broad amount of habitat and then a narrow amount. And these numbers are based on kind of that narrow definition of potential habitat, which really were palustrine emergent wetlands, from emergent class wetlands, and we also included split class wetlands. So if it was emergent scrub shrub wetland, we included that as potential habitat as well. So when we did the multiplication of the density and the area, you can see what our numbers are based on the different model types. So there's a wide range of numbers based on the model type, the species. Even within a model, there's a lot of variation just because, these things are have a range of abundance, a range of occurrence. Some occur more frequently than others, and all those things play into variance in our estimates. Now, what I think is interesting from this, even if we taking all that variation into consideration, what we did find is even for a species like least bittern that is hard to detect, has fairly, it's fairly rare, and it can be locally common, but fairly rare and infrequently detected. Our estimates are still in, the tens of thousands, and one of our estimates is even over 100,000. So these things are probably fairly, maybe more abundant out there than what we realize. And certainly things like, our rails that are hunted, I think we can feel pretty confident that the level of take, especially in a place like Michigan where very few people hunt rails, and so the number of individuals that are harvested is pretty low, I think we can be pretty comfortable that that's not having an impact on these species. There's a lot of refinement that we could do with more analysis. There are things here that were difficult, such as we didn't account for size of wetland, and that could be a problem for a species like American bittern. That's probably area sensitive, has a large home range. So there might be some additional work that we could do to really refine our estimates for some of these species, but it was a first step. So we did some other analyses I didn't want to take time to get into, but we did some additional analysis to assess, well, for these different species, how are we able, how well can we or how precise can we estimate population size, and how well can we track trends using things like occupancy? And what we found is there's some species that, like Virginia rail and Sora, they're common enough, they have high enough detectability that we could probably do a pretty good size of estimating populations in tracking population and occupancy over time, regardless of the spatial scale, whether we're doing it at the upper Midwest scale, BCR, which is a little bit smaller bird conservation regions within our area, or even at the state level. Other species like king rail and yellow rail. King rail is just so rare that we're never going to get enough data to be able to estimate population size or occupancy. Yellow rail is also really rare, and it tends to be nocturnal. So our survey just doesn't do a good job for that species. The other species kind of fall in between. So this really gave us a good idea of kind of what we can do moving forward with this survey and things we might be able to tweak to improve our ability to reach our objectives. So the next project I wanted to touch on was one that we did in the boreal hardwood transition part of Michigan, which is basically northern Michigan. It's BCR 12, if you're familiar with the bird conservation regions. But we wanted to evaluate how marsh birds respond to hydrologic alteration and restoration. And we did this using a combination of data from the Michigan Marsh Bird Survey that was used in those previous analyses, with additional sampling that we did in 3 parts of the Upper Peninsula. And I'll touch on those as well. And this project was spurred by interest by staff at CNE that had been doing some wetland. I'm calling it rehabilitation because it's not full restoration, but getting these wetlands on a trajectory based on some hydrologic work that they did to try to reverse some drainage and flooding. But as we got into it, we really realized, looking at this at a bigger scale could have some real value, as well as looking at the impacts of things like flooding, and then partial drainage of wetlands across this region. So we used data from the survey, as well as we had 3 years of sampling at the for this particular study. One of the things we also did, and this is a kind of a standard method I've used for several of our projects, was to sample fine scale habitat attributes around our survey points. And so we did this using half-meter by half-meter quadrats that we did 3 per point within 25 meters of each point. And we sampled things like water depth, depth of organic sediments, vegetation height, some of our dominant taxa, and percent cover of some different categories of growth patterns for wetland plants. So this was what we used in some of our analyses as well. Where we worked, some of our study sites was Muskong Bay and the St. Mary's River in the East UP. We had some sites, there were some coastal impoundments that had been opened up through excavating out portions of the dike system back in the mid-90s. So essentially that's a restoration of the normal hydrology of Lake Huron and the St. Mary's River. So we use that as some of our rehabilitated sites. Although these southern impoundments were also opened up, the beavers had plugged them up and they were effectively still impounded wetlands when we did our study. We also sampled some areas on the St. Mary's River a little further north of Muskong Bay, and for some additional reference sites. But we also had some partially drained wetlands here that you can see these. This is a really common technique in the East UP where there's heavy clay soils, and landowners would dig these kind of shallow furrows to help drain off surface water, and you can still see that in some of these places. So we included some of those sites as well. At Seney was a big part of the study as well. We had a combination of rehabilitated sites. Here we had there's a very large ditch project through Seney that was done in the early 1900s, and they've done a whole series of ditch plugs. So we had some rehabilitated sites here that we sampled. There were portions of a dike system that were opened up to restore hydrology that we sampled here. And then, through the rest of Seney, we had some sites that were still flooded with dikes, and some sites that were also partially had lowered water levels. So the normal flow through Seney is sheet flow from the northwest to the southeast. Well, if you put up a dike like this one here, you can increase water levels in front of it, but you also decrease the water table below it. So we sampled areas like that as well. And then the last kind of study area here was a Sturgeon River Sloughs, which is up near Houghton. It's a state wildlife management area, and we have a series of impounded diked wetlands here that we sampled. And then we sampled some reference wetlands off the Sturgeon River and that entered into the Portage River here. So just some highlights of what we found. Despite this range of altered and natural hydrology that we sampled, marsh bird use was really pretty consistent across all types. I think we analyzed a dozen or so different species that we encountered, and only 2 showed a significant difference. And that was snipe, which was actually observed more often at rehabilitated sites, and then sedge wren, which we found more abundant at both our lowered and our raised altered sites when compared to our rehabilitated and reference wetlands. Now for the sedge wren, I think this is not so much a function of the hydrology as much as it was the prevalence of things like grasses and sedges, as well as leaf litter that it uses for breeding. And so I think it was driven more by that. I won't get into a lot of details on this analysis, but it was a multivariate analysis we did of all the wetland, the 4 wetland types with all the species included at once. This is a nice analysis in that if you were seeing patterns in different use by wetland type, you'd see clustering here by different colors clustering together. That's not what we found. It's basically a shotgun blast here. So there's a lot of overlap, means they're similar. In looking at the wetland characteristics, so we did similar analysis of those variables we gathered at the habitat, that quadrat sampling. We saw some things we would expect. We saw water depth differed between the raised and the lowered wetland categories, and the other types were kind of intermediate. Sediment depth was higher in our altered wetlands compared to the rehabilitated and the reference wetlands. Open water was lower in our lowered water level wetlands than the others, which is what you'd expect. And we also saw lower levels of litter within our altered sites that had lower water levels, which is what you'd expect as well. With less flooding, there's a buildup of organic matter in those sites. So just a couple other final thoughts here. So for the area we looked at and the species we considered, our results indicate that wetlands with altered and rehabilitated hydrology supported marsh bird use at levels that were similar or greater than our reference sites. Now, a really important caveat is that I don't think this is necessarily what we'd find if we took the same kind of a project to a different part of the region, so southern part of the Great Lakes. We're talking about a part of the state that's still relatively less degraded, has less hydrologic impacts than we see in other parts of the state. Also, we weren't selecting small, what are often called restoration projects, where there's a lot of excavation or input of water control structures. Use might be totally different if we included projects such as that. So definitely more we could do in this area. And then the last project I'll touch on here was one that was focused on evaluating marsh bird and vegetation response to invasive Phragmites in Saginaw Bay, and areas that were managed for Phragmites. So this is a project we just wrapped up about a year or so ago. And the idea was Saginaw Bay has a pretty massive Phragmites infestation in its coastal wetlands. But there's also been a fair bit of management done. And so we saw it as an opportunity to kind of first compare, well, how does the vegetation community and marsh bird use compare between unmanaged Phragmites and sites that are, reference sites? Then we also could take and sample similarly in our managed wetlands and see how our managed wetlands compare to not only the unmanaged sites, but our reference wetlands. So is a good place where we could focus this kind of research. The complicating factor is that, and this is just a long-term trends in water levels for Lake Huron, and the management in Saginaw Bay, the wetlands we're looking at, occurred in 2017, which happened to coincide with above average water levels. So that was kind of a confounding factor that we had to kind of consider. And one of the benefits of having studies using a consistent protocol, sampling methods that we've been doing on Saginaw Bay for other studies, is that we had some data during the low water phase of Lake Huron in Saginaw Bay that we could use to kind of add a fourth category for another reference. So this is just where we sampled across. We had a pretty extensive sampling that happened over Saginaw Bay. and this is basically what we're looking at. So we had our managed sites, and these are a couple of examples that had been treated with herbicide and then followed up either with using a machine to remove the biomass, or typically, if it wasn't treated that way because they're coastal wetlands, ice and storm surges would wash the dead Phragmites out. We had unmanaged Phragmites. I'm sure a lot of you are pretty familiar with what that's like, and this is this is our botanist Rachel Hackett pushing her way through to do some sampling. Our reference sites were a combination of sites that could have been things like sedge meadows, dominated by sedges and grasses, with low influence from Phragmites, as well as we did include some cattail marshes, many of which were unfortunately invasive or hybrid cattail, but we felt like we don't have a lot of options for a reference, and at least that was more representative of probably what occurred there than Phragmites. So we used that as part of our reference as well. And then for our low water reference, we followed the same designations for our high water reference, and selected sites had been sampled during low conditions. So some highlights of the plant analysis, and not surprisingly, our unmanaged frag had lower plant diversity compared to our other categories. We had greater levels of invasive Phragmites percent cover, as well as density. So that's not surprising, and what that shows is that the management was effective at knocking back the Phragmites even 4 years after the treatment. And then we had some good response by some of the submersed aquatic plants within our managed wetlands. We saw lower levels of emergent habitat compared to the unmanaged in our reference. Because of high water, a lot of the emergents just hadn't grown back yet. And there's some other subtleties, but those were kind of the highlights from the plant standpoint. From a bird standpoint, it was really interesting in that we actually found that species that use dense emergent wetlands, like our bitterns, things like marsh wren, and they were found in similar abundance to between our reference and our unmanaged Phragmites. Species that need deep water marshes like piebald grebe, common gallinule, they were most abundant in our reference wetlands. Forster's tern, which these are essentially, we're counting foraging Forster's terns based on the methodology. Not surprisingly, they're not using the unmanaged Phragmites. They feed by foraging over open water, and that's just not available in that area. So interesting results from a bird standpoint as well. So some highlights: management definitely reduced the Phragmites through 4 years post-management, and our analyses suggest that the management has set those managed sites on a track to becoming similar to our reference wetlands. And I think a big caveat to this is that I think it was kind of a lucky happenstance that the management occurred just as above water lake levels have arrived. So I think that helped to keep the Phragmites from coming back in areas even after multiple years. From a bird standpoint, the Phragmites was used by species that require dense emergent vegetation, but those deeper water marsh species were more abundant at reference sites. And it's likely that probably the management caused some short-term loss of habitat for some of these species because of the loss of that emergent cover based on our analysis. In a big wetland complex like Saginaw Bay, I don't think that's anything really to be concerned about. But if it was in a different situation, you might need to do some things to ameliorate that. And then one of the things that's highlighted is just the difficulty that we find ourselves in now, from both a management and an assessment standpoint. We're now dealing with a system in Saginaw Bay that's highly degraded. We have multiple invasive species. It's not just Phragmites. We've got invasive cattail. We have now frogbit. We have Nitolopsis, a lot of different species. So planning and implementing species in a single species standpoint may not be the way we should be doing things. We might have to shift to our focus to multi-species management. And what this project highlights is that different ecosystem services are going to respond differently to treatment. And that's what we found, and why we sampled both the plants and the birds, because they respond differently. And you have to take that into consideration. And, to do this kind of assessment, we need reference sites. And it's getting harder and harder to find adequate reference sites in these degraded systems. Okay, so I'm close. I know I'm going pretty long here, but I'm close to wrapping up, and I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about this regional monitoring effort that I started out talking about. I think I've given some hopefully good evidence that this has been a valuable effort. We've gotten some really good data. We've learned a lot about these species, and I'm just highlighting a few projects that I was involved with. We've a whole bunch of partners that have been doing work themselves that's similar in other parts of the region, and we really have improved our knowledge base for these species. The downside is that we got a lot of great support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get these surveys going. It's not cheap. There's a lot of background work just to get these surveys started. But what's lacking is it doesn't take a huge amount of money to keep these surveys going, but it does take some money. You have to manage data. You have to continually recruit and train volunteers, and it takes at least some low level of support that hasn't necessarily been there for a lot of places. And that gets to volunteer recruitment and retention in a survey like this is difficult. This isn't like the breeding bird survey that's road-based, that just about anybody could do it. I mean, this is a random sample where people have to often slog through marshes, which is not easy work. I know better than anybody. And so we have that challenge, but we also have, by doing random sampling, you often have a mismatch of sites being sampled and where you have volunteers. And then you also have another challenge is that we need to sample in good places as well as bad places to learn more about these species. And if you've got trying to keep a volunteer motivated to go sample in a low quality wetland can be a challenge. And then we have some protocol related challenges that we need to address. Some of these species like king rail is a huge concern in our region, but yet we really can't provide much data for it because it's so rare. And we get a handful of observations, but you can't do much with that. And then other species like yellow rail, we would really need a different type of survey to get at that. So while we might be getting good information about the entire marsh bird community, we may not be getting the best information for these really high priority species that are receiving a lot of attention. And then another issue is that there's some evidence from some research that's been done in Ohio that even during what we're trying to design as a breeding survey for marsh birds, we're detecting migrants. So there are migrants moving through that are calling, and so that could completely be biasing our estimates, and it's something we need to explore further. And this is just kind of shows the level of sampling, and these are those primary sample units, or you could think of them as survey routes for the different states. And it shows the different approaches each state took. Wisconsin started pretty big, and then they had paid staff, and then their survey effort has essentially gone to nothing. I don't think they're even trying to survey marsh birds in recent years. Here in Michigan, we started small, ramped up with paid staff, and then our effort has kind of declined as we've lost some of that funding to keep things going. Ohio started small and stayed small, but they've been really consistent in what they've been doing. And in hindsight, maybe that was the best approach. Minnesota did a really large survey over a 2-year period, but it was intended just to be a kind of snapshot. Now, I do believe they're looking at trying to start their survey up again. But this is kind of the reality we're dealing with. So some thoughts on what we could do to address some of these challenges. We could try to find some operational support for these different states to coordinate their surveys. That's one approach. Another approach is to maybe look at shifting to a regional coordination, maybe having a organization or person that manages the volunteers at a regional scale, and maybe that could be more efficient. So that's something we're exploring. There are some things we could do if we can't mobilize as many people. We could take a look at using our data and combining it with other similar surveys that are going on, such as Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program and the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program. We have similar surveys. Maybe there are ways we can combine those surveys together to provide some good information. And then we're also considering maybe we because there are other surveys out there that can provide information on trends, maybe we focus more on addressing some of these management questions in restoration and things like that, and that maybe our survey is better suited to do. So that's some of the things we're talking about. And then as far as recruitment and retention of volunteers, I think having a small number of paid surveyors that we hire seasonally is a great way to kind of cover those gaps that volunteers may not be able to cover completely. That's one approach. There's also, we're interested in looking at some other approaches that would be less reliant on volunteers in the field, like acoustic recording units that might be able to give us data that is less labor intensive. So that's something we are looking at. And that fits into some of the limitations of the protocol. Looking at different survey techniques to get at some of these rare species, more analysis or research to address the influence of events. Is it something that's just happening in the southern part of the region, or is it common throughout? We don't really know. And then there might be some tweaks to the protocol that we could do that reduces the influence of migrants, such as maybe sampling later in the season or compressing surveys into a shorter period of time. And then some of this, I think, is just kind of conceptual. I think sometimes we get caught up in having to know, a population number. Maybe that's not what's important. Maybe an index of use over time, whether it's breeding and or migrants, maybe that's good enough information. And that's what we focus on. So these are the discussions we're having. And I see a lot of interest in continuing these surveys. And one of the things we're working on now that I'll wrap up here is we're in the early stages. I'm co-leading an effort with Rachel Pierce with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to take what we've learned through all this monitoring and research and start trying to apply that to getting more conservation work done on the ground for these species. So things like management, restoration, protection of these habitats for these species. So we're engaging with a broader partnership. We're trying to get more managers involved, and we're trying to develop a framework for what we need to do to try to increase conservation work for these species. And so, if that's something you might have an interest in and you haven't been contacted by us previously, feel free to get in touch with me. It's pretty exciting. I think we're gonna make some progress here in the next couple of years, and hopefully do some good things for these species. Okay, I will leave it there, and thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if folks have them.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. Um, if you have questions, please type them using the Q&A function at the bottom or top of your screen. So far, we have 2 questions.
Okay,
Ready for the first?
sure thing.
Okay. Has MNFI considered partnering with Eagle Wetland Mitigation Monitoring Program to collect
Mm,
recordings of these primary and secondary target species via annual wetland mitigation monitoring reports? For example, this individual has observed Sora and Wilson snipe
mhm.
during wetland bank monitoring, and it seems like an opportunity for free data.
I We have not, I haven't had any connection with Eagle folks. I'd be definitely interested and willing to um speak with whoever put in the question. I see some opportunity where we could add some sites like that. It could be as simple as maybe uh, asking people who are monitoring these mitigation sites to use the protocol that we've been using, and then it wouldn't be too hard to incorporate that into a larger data set. So yeah, definitely something I'd be willing to explore.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Next question. Uh, well, question slash comment. Okay. Have you seen the rise of European frogbit in your
Mhm.
studies, which is now appearing to severely ravage lakes in southeast Michigan and elsewhere? This individual has been involved in marsh sampling for many
Mhm.
years, but has never seen an invasive species with this much potential for degrading habitats so quickly.
Yeah. I've actually been involved with some research on frogbit with some collaborators at CMU. We did some work on Saginaw Bay that looking at the effects of frogbit on the plant community, some animal species. So yeah, I'm aware of it. It's scary, no doubt. And there's no easy fix for it, unfortunately. But I totally agree.
All right. How or where are you recruiting volunteers?
Well, at the moment, I'm not recruiting volunteers because essentially what happened was we were still continuing with the survey. We hit COVID, and that pretty well shut things down for a couple of years. And because there's some uncertainty with are we going to continue with the survey as is? Are we going to make some tweaks to it? I've been kind of waiting to do a push to recruit volunteers until we get, some support to do it and have a better sense of how we want to go forward. What we've done in the past, we've met with groups like, Audubon groups. We've worked through bird related meetings. We've done, kind of emails targeting different partnerships. And I know there's a lot more we could do moving forward, but I've been kind of waiting until some clarity comes with how we're going to move forward with the survey.
Okay. Next question. Are there any discussions on standardizing a protocol for ARUs for marsh bird
Hmm.
surveys?
Not that I'm aware of. There are studies where they've used them in for different species, such as up in northern Michigan and some other areas for yellow rail. Um, I'm not aware of any efforts to standardize it as of yet. One of the complications with ARUs is, you can do a good job of detecting whether they're there or not, but you don't have a good sense of, well, how big of an area are you covering? In the distance at which you can detect the species can change with weather conditions. So it gets complicated really fast. There are ways that I've read about that I'd be interested in exploring where you can, because we have some ARUs now that are have GPS timestamps, where you can, instead of just using one ARU at a point, you can set up an array of, maybe 4 or 5, so that you can then, by using multiple ARUs that are detecting the individual bird at multiple locations, you can then triangulate the location of the bird. And what that then does is it allows you to come up with a density estimate, which would make the data a lot more valuable. So I guess that's a long-winded answer to your question. No, I don't think we have a standardization. I think we've got some interest in exploring this. And I'd also like to see us do some comparisons of using ARUs compared with human observers. So I think there's some things, on the horizon that would help us look at using this as a better tool for surveying these birds.
Okay, are there any more questions out there? We'll wait 15 seconds to see.
Sure.
All right, seems like
Okay.
that's everything.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. That was a great
Well,
presentation.
thanks.
Love learning about marsh birds.
Yeah, and I'd encourage folks, if you have questions or you want to chat about something, go ahead and drop me an email, give me a call. I'd be happy to talk more. And
Great.
thanks everybody for attending.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.